Hello, everyone, and we're going to be talking about this book, David's book, front cover of the New York Times book section. I noticed, and there's a very good line from Antony Blinken at the beginning of the epilogue of the book. This is Secretary of State Blinken in February last year, February 2023. He says, "This is not the world we wanted or were trying to shape after the Cold War." And here we are today. We've seen an interview with President Zelensky of Ukraine in the New York Times, sounding both somewhat annoyed and arguably somewhat desperate. This new Russian 10 kilometers at least in the north have fallen in recent days, urging the US to give it more support. At CNN at 4 o'clock this afternoon, we had a live interview with President Benjamin Netanyahu from Jerusalem, outraged by the actions yesterday by the International Criminal Court in the prosecutors seeking arrest warrants for him and the Israeli Defense Minister, as well as for top Hamas leadership. This world which did not turn out, certainly as of today, this week, this year, this decade, quite as the framers of American statecraft perhaps intended in '89 or indeed in the year 2000, 2001. Your book is really the story of how things went wrong or things did not turn out the way we thought, and it's a story, it's a narrative as well as a history. And I think, I'd just say to people, what's so vital about it and so interesting is, the sweep of events. Initially, a lot of history moves very quickly through the book. Quite quickly becomes a deeply reported story of one administration, the current administration's task in battling with any number of difficult issues in the national security and foreign policy arena. So I'd like you to talk about the book and your ambition for the book. But I guess the one question I'd like you to reflect on at the start is, you can read this book as a chronicle of mistakes and false assumptions and unrealistic hopes. Or you can read it as a series of profound, kind of ineluctable forces playing through the world, many of which might have happened and erupted and had their effect irrespective of what policymakers chose. But when we ask the question of why, which is maybe also a question of who's to blame, what answers do you come up with for that?
Well, Mark, I think you've gone straight to the heart of the question in the book. But I just want to, before I answer you, just thank everybody for coming. You've got a lot of things you can do when you're on a nice spring evening in New York. I want to thank my friend Mark for coming out here to do this. We've done things like this back and forth over the years. Mark was, of course, as you heard, the president of the New York Times Company. What they didn't say along the way was he and his colleagues, I think, saved the modern New York Times. And so when you pick it up in the morning or you pick up your phone and you're reading those updates, it's because of the transition that Mark brought about. And he's now got the challenge of doing this all again at CNN. Which I wish you luck. And I want to thank my wife, Cheryl, who's here in the front, and Mary Brooks, who's sitting with her, who worked with me on this book and has worked with me over the past 6 years on other books and documentaries, and played a critical role in both researching and writing this. So to your question, was this inevitable that we would find ourselves in new Cold Wars with an S, in which we are facing off against our two biggest nuclear rivals? Or was there something we could have done to avoid it? And I guess the subtext of your question is, was there bad intelligence involved? Was there bad luck involved? Was there too much wishful thinking? There's a little bit of all of the above, and maybe I should take them separately with Russia and China. In Russia's case, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and of course the fall of the Berlin Wall preceded that, I think that we were so enamored of the thought that the Cold War had ended in a way that we didn't even imagine, that we just assumed that Francis Fukuyama and others like him were right. This really was the end of history. We were all coalescing into a great liberal democratic order. And while there are people who warned that wasn't going to be the case, including George Kennan, the architect of containment policy, I think what we did was, over the years, with both Russia and China, is that we overemphasized every cooperative effort we had together as a sign that we were headed that way. And we excused every piece of evidence that no, they were pursuing their old national interests.
Yeah.
So
a kind of confirmation bias, as it were.
Complete confirmation bias, made worse by the fact that we projected on the Chinese and the Russians our own thinking about these issues, which is to say, well, of course Russia wants more territory. I'm sure Putin's unhappy, but not so unhappy that he would risk his oil and gas revenues flowing to Europe. And of course the Chinese are unhappy that they don't have more control over the South China Sea and so forth and so on, or lands that they want in the Philippines, or that they don't have Taiwan, but they wouldn't risk their exports to the United States and the rest of the world that have been the greatest anti-poverty program in world history. And we just convinced ourselves that would drive them. And it wasn't just Donald Trump, but Trump was the far end of this, who basically would say, well, for the right trade deal, we'll bring them under control. But before that, we had Bill Clinton showing up at Beijing University and giving a speech in which he said the internet will undercut the Communist Party of China and turn this place into a democracy. And that containing the democratic forces that would be brought in by the internet would be essentially like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. Well, it turned out these guys were pretty good Jell-O nailers, and they did a superb job in taking those technologies and using them for purposes of repression. In Putin's case, there's a scene that opens the first chapter in which Putin and his then wife and George Bush and Laura Bush are floating down the Neva River in a giant yacht. It's just about this time of year, late May, early June. The sun's up till 10 or 11 in St. Petersburg. And as they're having all this wonderful food, I was in the pool reporter's boat behind, they're discussing, we're not eating as well, Mark, by any means. But we also weren't being served by this lurking guy who turned out to be
Prigozhin, of course, is serving the. That's right. He's the man and the waiters.
Right. So that scene sort of sets up the characters to come back. But they're talking about Russia joining the WTO and the possibility that Russia might join NATO. Right. And last night we were at a book discussion on this, and moderator's role that you're in right now is being played by Richard Haas, and he said, yes, I wrote that memo about, whether they could, right? So, and indeed he had. So that's where our brains were, that this could be going this way. And in Russia's case, we didn't see the evidence the other way until 2007, when Putin gave the speech at the Munich Security Conference saying there are parts of Peter the Great's Russia that need to be restored to the empire. And we didn't see it with China until Xi Jinping came along.
And if we just pause for a moment in 2007, this is a moment which again is highlighted in the book when Putin's agenda begins to become clear. That you could argue that for many years the clarity was ignored by Western policymakers. I mean, Antony Blinken talking today about Putin, or very recently, talks about George Kennan's long telegram.
That's right.
And the idea that, don't get misled by communism. There's a lot of what's going on in Russia. This is, the long telegram is 1946, I think, just after the Second World War, anyway, beginning of the First Cold War. Don't think this is just about communism. There's a lot of classic, insecure Russian, imperial thinking, Tsarist imperial thinking about buffer zones and all the rest of it. And Blinken says in the 2020s, we can now understand how deep that went in Putin's thought.
He said outright that you could take the long telegram and every place you see the word Soviet Union, knock it out and put modern Russia, and the analysis would fit.
So this notion then that communism falls, there's an assumption, therefore, that Russia will flip to a more open, more potentially Western-friendly, and in fact, all that happens is one element of what created the First Cold War has gone, but other elements will turn out still to be in place or will quickly return again.
That's right. And so that gets to the question, is this of the nature of the nations that we're dealing with? And does it mean that this was all inevitable? I actually think this had more to do with leaders than just national instinct. That in Putin's case, you had the grievances of the collapse of the Soviet Union. He's not trying to restore the Soviet Union. He thinks the Soviet leaders were idiots who gave far too much power to the socialist republics. And when you go into his office, he doesn't have pictures of Lenin and Stalin around. He has a bust of Peter the Great.
Yeah.
That's the Russia he wants to restore. For Xi Jinping, I think it was a much harder thing because his predecessors were experimenting with democracy. In fact, there's a section in the book where Bush shows up in Beijing and he says, there are local elections happening, democratic elections that were allowed in towns and so forth. It was part of the effort to convince people that the government really was going to rout out corruption.
Yeah,
and that if you had local leaders...
And quite lively local consumer journalism and so forth.
Yeah.
If a school collapsed, that they would be covered with surprising, back in the,
That's
in
right.
the 80s, 90s.
Real stuff where you discovered that somebody was on the take and, using bad cement, and that's how come these kids just got crushed in the collapse.
Yeah.
Or it was some company where... state-owned company where the leadership was on the take, and it explains how come the water's polluted for the entire town. And so the leaders, particularly under Hu Jintao's time and some under Jiang Zemin, saw this as a way to cleanse the place. But Bush overread it and said, and I look forward to the day when there will be national elections here, and I'm told by your leadership we're headed toward that day. Well, that was completely wrong. They overinvested in Putin. There were, in the 8 years that Bush was president, there were more than 24 meetings between Bush and Putin. You know how many there have been between Biden and Putin? 1. And my guess is no matter how the election turns out in November, 1 will remain the number for that. So we're at such a different place. And then journalistically we are. I mean, our news bureau was basically thrown out of China, and we've just begun to get people back in. And in Russia's case, we had to pull all our correspondents. We had them all through the Stalin era.
Yeah.
We had to pull them because the national security law basically would have thrown them in jail for saying that the war in Ukraine was not a special military operation.
It was a war. And to say it was the war was a war is enough to.
Yep. It's a very different era. And so I don't blame the American leadership for wanting this outcome and trying to push Russia and China in that direction. I do blame them for not waking up earlier. And this is not a Democratic or Republican thing. It's a Democratic and Republican thing. For not waking up.
Well, we might come back to that business of
to
continuity in American policy, because local political debate often wants to emphasize differences between the administrations, and we understand why, and we might talk about the upcoming election as well. But much of this, actually, we see many of the same thinking with variation carrying on.
Yep.
And if we stick with Putin, by 2014, he invades Crimea.
That's right. So
and essentially nothing happens.
That's right. There's a chapter in the book, with apologies to Marilyn Monroe, called The 7-Year Itch. So in 2007, he announces where he's going.
Yeah.
And Bob Gates stands up and says, I've been through one Cold War, I'm not really eager to go through another. Then the defense secretary. 7 years later, he takes Crimea. It takes us a year to put together with the Europeans significant sanctions. And the next year, 2015, Angela Merkel signs the Nord Stream 2 pipeline agreement, funneling Russian gas around Ukraine, so they won't get any revenue from it, into Germany, and says Putin is a reliable supplier. So what's Putin to conclude when he's debating whether or not he's going to take the entirety of Ukraine? He's probably concluding we're not serious about stopping him. And, we can talk later about why it was such a failure at the beginning, but as you suggested at the start of this session, now the mass of the Russian force, the larger population, the ability to produce ammunition so much faster, bringing in their electronic warfare skills to confuse our missiles and make them lose contact with GPS. This is all now kicking in 2 years later, after they completely botched the early part, thinking it was going to be easy. And that's why you heard from Zelensky today that, we've got to be able to get at the Russians in Russian territory with American-made equipment and with American.
You've got, I think, somewhere in the book, an American military leader saying, it took them time, but the Russians got their shit together.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah,
that's exactly right. And they've gotten it together in so many different ways. There's a section in the book where Mary and I sit down with Mark Milley for what turned out to be like a 3.5-hour dinner.
Yeah.
And he says in this at one point, at first we thought this was going to be a clean cyber war.
Yeah.
Then we thought it was going to be a World War II style tank war. And then it turned out to be effing World War I, trench warfare. And what I say in the book is, it's actually all three. It's 1914, it's 1941, and it's 2024, all rolled together.
Well, I'm going to come back to the big themes. But so I've got a question here, which I might wrong time in the, but there's a skeptic somewhere in the. He's quoting the review, I think.
Uh-huh.
The establishment would never allow a reporter like Sanger to peer inside their systems and reveal what he finds. I mean, well, I'm not quite sure what's meant by that, but the one of the things that's really striking in your reporting for the New York Times, in your commentary for CNN, and in this book, is two things. One of which is the willingness for the most senior members of different branches of the United States government and armed forces and the security forces, security services, intelligence services, to talk to you quite often, kind of on the record, but on the record and off the record. And secondly, so certainly the access you get to top people, but secondly the kind of stories you've been able to break over this period about what's really going on. And, how does that work? I'm a journalist, and
Yeah.
I've even been an investigative journalist myself, and
Yeah.
I'm now an editor. I mean, and I want to say that you do some of the reporting you do surprises and amazes most other journalists. So what's going on there, David?
Well, thank you for saying so. Some days I don't feel it as much. And first of all, without aging myself here, I've been around for a while here. So, and a good deal of what happens in Washington in reporting comes from the trust they have that they've dealt with you for years and years. And so you're going to read in this book Bill Burns, the director of the CIA, talking pretty candidly about his meetings with Putin when he was sent out to say, if you do this war, you're making a big mistake. You're going to read Avril Haines, the director of national intelligence, talk about what she thinks the mistakes were we made in Afghanistan. I think they do this because, in part, I hope they think they're going to get at least a fair hearing. And secondly, because I hope over time I've been able to persuade them that the natural instinct for secrecy that most governments have makes sense sometimes, but sometimes stands in the way of our own deterrent effect. The last book I wrote, spoke about here at the 92nd Street Y, was a book about cyber warfare, which is probably the most secretive kind of operations the U.S. runs because it's a weapon that was designed by the intelligence agencies. But I think over time, it's become evident to some of the leadership that there is benefit to them in explaining not only our logic, but our offensive capabilities. Because if the adversary doesn't know it, it's not likely to be much of a deterrent. So I think it's that mix of things. I wish I could tell you there was a special sauce to it, but there isn't. It's just going at it.
Yeah. And if we just stick with Putin for a moment, I mean, the as recently as the Trump administration, perhaps partly because from, I guess, 2017 onwards, President Trump himself has a desire to, on the one hand, focus on Ukraine as supposedly the source of election interference and also potentially of connection to corruption by Hunter Biden. He's trying to make that case. And for that, and for other reasons, it suits him to regard Vladimir Putin as potentially very biddable. He praises him frequently in public, still does occasionally to this day, and certainly seemed to make an attempt to, in office, to forge a relationship with him. In the Biden administration, and in particularly after, of course, the second massive invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago, there seems to be, one might say, at last, realism about what America is dealing with. Is that fair, do you think?
I think that's completely fair. I mean, for Trump's case, there was this credulousness about dealing with him. And we've never gotten to the bottom of why that was. If he thought he had business deals he was going to do later, if he just admires authoritarians along the way. You may recall, Mark, that after the first time that Trump and Putin met in Hamburg, the first year of Trump's presidency, they talked a little bit about the election in private. And of course, once again, there was a denial from Putin that they had been involved in any of the activities, which we've tracked back in a pretty clear cyber way. And at the end of the summit, I'm checking out of my hotel, and Trump goes out to Air Force One, and he's waiting on the tarmac to take off. And he calls me on my cell phone. And he said, David, it's been the most remarkable thing. Putin just told me that it couldn't have been them who broke into the DNC computers
Yeah.
because they are so good at cyber, we never would have found them. I'm like staring at the phone. And I suddenly realize if I utter one word of agreement, he's going to walk out and say, hey, you know, the New York Times' cyber guy is in agreement with Putin.
Yeah.
And I said, well, you know, this runs contrary to what all of your intelligence services told you. And so you're going to have to choose, Mr. President, do you believe them or do you believe Putin?
Yeah.
And he said, oh, I was told that by, you know, and he names all of the Obama era ones. He said, intelligence leaders, and he said, they're all a bunch of political hacks. And he said, I fired Comey. I said, yeah, I read about that, sir. And I pointed out to him that he had just promoted or extended the NSA head at the time, who also took that view and was the one who knew cyber the best. And he said, oh, yeah, he's a great guy. He's just like, no, right. So then you go on to Biden. And Biden goes into the election convinced that Putin was trying to get Trump elected, right? So no wonder that he's got it in for him. And at that one meeting that they had together, which was in Geneva in June of 2021, there was a reason for that meeting. And it wasn't Ukraine, because the Ukraine invasion hadn't happened. It was the hack of the colonial pipeline system here. And Biden wanted to say to Putin, if there are hackers working from your territory who are cutting off our oil shipments and the ability to run jet fuel up and down the East Coast, you know, you're going to be held responsible for it. Well, it sounded great, but I haven't noticed that ransomware has slowed down much. Yeah. And I'm not sure he really has held him accountable for it.
So let's just step back. I mean, I guess, 7 months, 7.5 months left of this Biden administration, yeah. And we don't know whether he's going to get re-elected or whether it'll be another 4 years of Donald Trump. What's your assessment? I mean, you know, in many ways the book is about the immense challenges that were bequeathed to the Biden administration by its predecessors of both parties. What's your assessment of the way from Afghanistan to China and Taiwan to Putin and Ukraine to Israel, Gaza and the Middle East, about how well the Biden administration has addressed this, frankly, rather astonishingly lively and unpredictable bundle of trouble in terms of foreign affairs?
Well, I think it's fair to say, as you suggested, Mark, that all of what was brewing with Russia and China, and to some degree the Middle East, sort of crashed into this administration at once. And they happened to be the one at the moment the music stopped, you know, looking for how they were going to go deal with this. They started off in the worst of ways, which was Afghanistan. Yeah. And I would say the Afghanistan chapter is probably the most critical one of Biden.
Yeah.
Not that the idea of getting out of Afghanistan was wrong. In fact, it was the one thing that Biden and Trump agreed on during the 2020 campaign. And
Obama probably instinctively also agreed with it.
Yeah, but didn't do it.
Didn't do it.
Right.
Got persuaded to do the surge instead. But
and you'll remember that Trump actually issued a tweet in December of his last time in office, saying we're going to get out by Christmas, and that was like a week away, and he had to be talked out of this by his own staff. What I argue in this is it was the right idea. It was poorly executed because once the president made the decision, they did not get everybody out who they needed to get out quickly enough. But that the failure was so big with the tragic loss of, I think, 13 Americans, that it actually had the same effect on his staff as the messing up the Bay of Pigs had on Kennedy, which was to realize that even though they had all worked together so closely, that Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and Lloyd Austin all knew each other for years and years, that they were entirely capable of inattention and screwing up. And that actually unified their team just in the nick of time for the growing evidence that Russia was getting ready to invade Ukraine. And I think they did a pretty brilliant job of revealing the intelligence. ahead of time.
Which was a really unusual, bold thing to do, and the intelligence, which turned out to be surprisingly accurate and precise, was poo-pooed not just by the Russians, who denied everything, of course, but also by
the Europeans.
Europeans, yeah.
The book opens up with me showing up at the Munich Security Conference a week before the invasion, and I'm walking around, and all these European leaders are saying, "Oh, Putin's just bluffing. He's just." Zelensky said the same thing to us at that session, and on the Saturday before the invasion, I sit down and have breakfast with Blinken and a group of reporters, and I took out my list of European leaders who thought this wasn't going to happen, and he took out his list of European leaders who thought, and it was remarkable. The German intelligence head was so convinced that there was going to be no invasion that he was in Kyiv the morning of the invasion, which was the following Thursday. Yeah. And they had to airlift him out. Okay. Yeah. So that was pretty terrible. They did a very good job on prepping for the invasion, and it meant that after the invasion actually happened, they were able to organize the sanctions in the Europeans much more quickly, and all of NATO. I think they've conducted the war pretty well up until this point, where I can understand why Zelensky thinks he needs more. I think they did a very good job in confronting the Chinese by cutting off the most key technologies, the high-end semiconductors, those of 3-nanometer circuitry, and smaller, the equipment to go make them. They actually have executed a series of actions against the Chinese that have been so effective that Xi Jinping has complained about it quite publicly. When you get to the Middle East, the subject on which I'm sure everybody in this room has got pretty strong opinions out here, I think Biden let his old views of where America was prevail, and I think he was taken by surprise by the reaction, by the quickness of the reaction once the bombing of civilians in Gaza happened. It was Biden who warned the Israelis on his trip there that after 9/11 we made a lot of big mistakes. But I think he reacted too slowly when it became clear that the Israelis were going off in a version of those same mistakes. And it's really taken until recent weeks for him to catch up with that. And it may be that he lost a lot of the left along the way. We won't know till the election. My guess is, as people face the election, they're going to think, well, Donald Trump would have been a better solution to that problem? I don't think so.
And you've got this phrase from H.R. McMaster, who was one of Donald Trump's rather brief-lived national security advisors.
He went through 4 in 4 years.
It's amazing, yeah. About America, not about Trump, but about America and strategic narcissism. Right. The idea, this American idea that we the United States can have a sufficient power and sway to dictate what happens. It's not always what happens. How much today? Let's take Israel and Gaza. If Biden had taken a different line, it might well have played better at home with his own party, younger and more left part of his own party. How much do you think it would have actually changed what happened in terms of thinking in Jerusalem about that conflict?
It's hard to know because the country was, pretty well unified in its understandable outrage and anger after October 7th. And I remember you and I were having breakfast on the morning of October 7th as this was unfolding and trying to figure out how bad this was going to get. I don't think either one of us had an imagination that it would get this bad.
And I was starting at CNN 2 days later, by the way.
Yes. I think that's why we were having breakfast. Yes.
Right. Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is that I think if Biden had been clearer privately and perhaps publicly to Netanyahu that we could not see American 2,000-pound bombs being used indiscriminately against civilians, and that they would be cut off if that was happening, he might have been able to enforce a better plan. Now, it's possible that the answer to this is no, Netanyahu was so wrapped up in pursuing the war in part out of the embarrassment of their own intelligence failures when it was clear they had warning, in part out of embarrassment of the slowness of the IDF to respond, in part out of his concern about staying in office, that it wouldn't have made a difference. But I actually think I think Biden was 2 or 3 months slow on this. And what's interesting is you dig into the end of the book on this, his own staff was urging him to move more quickly. Certainly Secretary Blinken, to some degree Jake Sullivan, and it just took the president his own time to come around to this.
Interesting. Now, in June, on June 27th at CNN, we're going to be staging a debate between...
I've read about that, yeah.
Joe Biden and Donald Trump. I mean, you're pretty much on the payroll, so can I ask you for some advice about what questions we should ask them, specifically about the area of this book, about foreign policy, national security policy? What would you ask them?
I'd offer these up.
If you were Jake Tapper or...
I'd offer these up for free even if I wasn't on the payroll. But let me give you one, but then I'm going to turn it on you about that debate itself. So a big theme of the book, Mark, is that we are now seeing Russia and China, and to a lesser degree Iran and North Korea, come together in not an alliance, but a pretty uneasy partnership to resist American influence, Western institutions, come up with an alternative approach. This is exactly what Nixon and Kissinger were trying to avoid when they did the opening to China in the early 1970s. And in the last months of his life, I talked to Kissinger some about this, and his big concern was his life's work was coming undone here.
Yeah.
And it was. I have not heard any discussion in this campaign so far, because we've had a little trial going on across town. We've had divisions over abortion, Dobbs, immigration, and so forth, of the central strategic question that I think will dominate the country for the next 30 or 40 years, which is there anything we can or should be doing to get in the way of that concentration of forces? Because if that really turns into a real alliance, and I don't think it's there yet, we have to rethink our nuclear strategy, or may have to rethink our nuclear strategy. We have to rethink our defense budgets. We have to rethink the question of our supply chains, what we're willing to get from whom. We're doing a little bit of that anyway, but I don't think it has struck anybody how big a change that would be. And I haven't heard from either President Biden or former President Trump a strategy for dealing with this, or an explanation that you shouldn't really worry about it. And so my question would be to each one of them, is this a problem? And what would you do about it in the next 4 years? That said, let me say, there was a time in presidential debates when we dealt with these. In the 1960 debate between Nixon and Kennedy, if you turn off the video and stop looking at who was sweating and who looked young and vibrant and all that, and just ask the question, what are they talking about and how are they debating it? It's a pretty sophisticated discussion of deterrence in the nuclear age between the old Soviet Union and the U.S. One that I'm not sure Americans would sit still for today.
Well, I think I wanted to ask you that. I mean, that's because they knew watching millions of Americans, partly because of the fear of nuclear annihilation, and also the great battle between democracy and capitalism and communism, were really focused on it. I mean, hearing both politicians and the public talking about Ukraine. I mean, the Neville Chamberlain's words in 1938 about Czechoslovakia and why essentially Britain and France had decided to let Hitler go ahead with Czechoslovakia. He described the invasion or the Nazi incursion into Czechoslovakia as a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. And
sounds a lot like the Republican group that opposed the continued aid to Ukraine. Now, they got past that this time, not necessarily well. Well, what impresses me about this debate that's coming up, Mark, is the way you have designed it, and you'll have to tell me if this was deliberate or not, is essentially a lot like the Nixon-Kennedy debate.
Yes, yes.
You're going to be in a studio.
In other words, just so the audience knows, it's going to be a pretty simple affair. A couple of moderators,
Jake Tapper and Dana
Jake Tapper and Dana Bash, our most experienced leading political commentators and correspondents and anchors. And it's going to be a series of questions to the candidates with fairly strict standard rules about how long
no audience.
And no audience. And we want to make this a policy forward, broad-ranging opportunity for both of these two candidates to get their points across and answer further questions about their policies and to have a chance to debate with each other. And
so how did you make this happen? Because a month ago, I would have bet that there would be no debate.
So you don't. I mean, I'm going to answer in a fairly broad way, but I think it's the real answer. To state the obvious, presidential debates don't happen because of a commission for presidential debates or because of any broadcaster. They happen because the candidates decide it's in their best interest, and perhaps they also believe it's in the public interest, to have a debate. And debates happen if, and only if, circumstances arrive where both candidates, more or less at the same time, reach the conclusion they should do one, and they should do one at a given place and a given time and on given terms. And that's what happened last week. And the media is slightly puzzled because it happened suddenly. I think I'm here to tell you it happened suddenly. Minute by minute, I was about to go on stage. We have a big advertising day called the Upfront, and I was. We sent our letter out to the candidates at 10 o'clock, exactly as this advertising event began, and had positive confirmation. So acceptance by both candidates by 10:40, 10:45, and I went on stage and announced it. So it happened very quickly, but it happened because both campaigns and both candidates decided they wanted to do it, and believe me, they will have thought about it very carefully. And you can speculate about why, but I think it's a good thing. I mean, I think it's good.
Timing is everything, and Biden has been running a campaign in which he was sort of acting like he was winning, but the polls don't suggest that, and maybe he's felt that it was his moment.
Well, you have to ask him, and indeed Donald Trump, why they both agreed to this debate and the ABC debate in September at this moment and in this way. But these things don't happen because of clever stratagems by broadcasters. They happen for fundamental political reasons. These guys have decided on balance that they want to go ahead and do it. But it's possible that could change before it happens. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time these things have had bumps along the road. But I certainly hope that we get there cleanly. I have no reason to think we won't, and that we can have a good, fair Marcus of Queensberry rules boxing match.
Yeah.
So,
To your question about what questions you ask, so I think Russia and China are the key part of that. I think it is worth asking President Trump, you've said you'll end the war in 24 hours? I can't imagine a way to do that other than calling Vladimir Putin and telling him he can have the lands that he's already taken, which is a deal I think Putin would take and Ukraine wouldn't. Is that what he has in mind? And I'd ask Biden on Ukraine, the question, you said we would stick with this as long as it takes. As long as it takes to do what? Ukrainian victory? Or
a Ukrainian leader, was it yesterday or certainly this week, talked about the need for America and its allies to deliver $1 trillion of aid.
Yeah.
So $1,000 billion of aid. Because of the disproportionate resources available to Russia and Ukraine.
So that's a funny.
If that's what it takes to achieve for Ukraine to achieve a victory, in other words, I assume the ejection of Russian forces from the majority, or perhaps even in theory, all of the land that they've taken. Is that something which is any American president could contemplate?
I can't imagine it is, and it's about what the estimate was going to be, about what it would take over 10 years to rebuild Afghanistan and turn it into an operating democracy, and Obama decided not to go do that. You know, $1 trillion just doesn't go as far as it used to anymore.
That's right. In good old days, you could see a Broadway show and have dinner and
Yeah.
still have change. That's right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Something for breakfast.
So we've got a couple of questions about that. And this is maybe a few you've already answered. What is the right answer as to how the US and EU should support Ukraine over the next 3 to 5 years? So we talked about things, neither of which seems, peace in one day, or $1 trillion. What then, knowing what we know, should they do?
So at the end of the book, I say that we have to begin to think about Ukraine's security, not necessarily in terms of territory, but what it needs to be a thriving democracy, a surviving economy. Its borders over the years have shifted, needless to say, even in the past century. Parts, Lviv, used to be part of Poland, so forth and so on. I don't need to tell you this has always moved. What I think they need are three things. They need to be able to protect Kyiv and the leadership. They need to be able to protect the industrial center of the country and get industry up and running again. They need a corridor to the sea so they can export their wheat and other farm goods. And if at the end of the day, that means an armistice where the exact lines are not set, that might be okay. Think back to 1953.
So when you say, just again, so I make sure I understand. In other words, they stop fighting and
leave the exact boundaries to be figured out later on.
Which means that de facto they're occupying the current frontline trenches, as it were, and those become de facto until some ultimate peace treaty where the two sides.
That's right. And what's that remind you of? It's the Korea solution, right? Yeah. So if somebody had gone to South Korea in 1953 and said to them, "You're not going to get back all the land you want, but a half century from now, you're going to be the world's 10th or 11th largest economy. You're going to be producing cars and semiconductors, and your opponent is still going to be having a hard time turning the lights on," yeah. I think they'd take that deal. And
your capital city will still be, 35 miles or something from the DMZ.
And you've got a nuclear problem. Right. I'm not suggesting this has been a perfect solution, but it's worked out a lot better than the South Koreans had. And Ukraine, given the talents of its people and the work of its software engineers and the resourcefulness of it, I think they have a shot of being another South Korea. It is not a guaranteed thing. What else are we going to need to do? Going to need to get them into the EU. And at some moment, we are going to have to get ourselves around this thought, which started in the Bush administration and is carried on through, that they can never be in NATO. Because in the end, what we've learned about Vladimir Putin is he may be willing to take on Ukraine, but so far he has not sent a single missile into NATO territory. He does not want to be in a conflict with NATO. Now, if I was Putin, I would make the requirement for that armistice that Ukraine never gets into NATO. And that's, I think, going to be the rub.
Okay, now we've got another question. Big simple question. Is nuclear war less of a threat today? And what I want to say is, if we think about the threat of a major nuclear exchange, do we think that threat, firstly, is less than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 25 years ago? And how do you think that will change? Is there a risk that, given the many instabilities in the world, that the threat level increases over the next 5 or 10 years rather than decreases.
I think the threat level has increased dramatically in the past 2 or 3 years, but not of the kind of traditional nuclear exchange that we worried about in the old Cold War. You know, the old Cold War was primarily a battle between two large militaries and largely a nuclear standoff. And we came to the thinking about mutually assured destruction because we knew them, they knew us, and over time, after the Cuban Missile Crisis scared the bejesus out of all of us, there was some...
And weirdly, that creates the kind of stability.
It did, and a predictability. And that lasted until the past couple of years. I think the most dramatic chapter in the book starts a few blocks from here when Joe Biden, in October of 2022, went to a fundraiser at James Murdoch's house. The Democratic black sheep of the Murdoch family. Yeah. And everybody's standing around looking at the art and having a nice sip of wine, and Biden comes in, having just been briefed, although he didn't say this to them, in the past few days, that the United States had picked up intercepts of Russian generals talking about using tactical nuclear weapons, battlefield nuclear weapons against the Ukrainians. This was at the
and in a way that made those listening think it was
they thought it
practical
was
and real.
Not only practical and real, but under some conditions, a 50-50 chance it was going to happen.
Which is an astonishing moment, I mean, and terrifying moment.
A moment we have not had since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
And Biden, because he's overly sharing at these fundraisers, basically said, we're at the greatest moment of nuclear peril than we had been since October of 1962, which was to the week 60 years before. And he starts describing the chances that Putin would actually go through with this. This is in the evening, and I hear this thing. I'm looking at the transcript. I call up some of his aides. I said, what is this about? He said, oh, God, he's giving the Armageddon speech. We just got it in the Oval Office this morning. Right.
No. Yes.
So,
if you're a sadist, looking at Anthony Blinken's face sometimes when the president's speaking,
yes,
is quite
good. Right. Why is he doing this?
What's he going to say next?
Right. Yeah. And I'm sure that everybody who went out there in the hope at that dinner that they could spend the weekend out in the Hamptons saying, well, the president told me over cocktails, are now thinking, how deep a tunnel can I build under my Hamptons house, right? So this was, I think, a sign of things to come, because we are in a period of time where the countries that have nuclear weapons, some of them, may well see a moment for nuclear blackmail. We've seen Putin try it several times. We've seen the Chinese think about it in terms of how they might use this for Taiwan. If you're Iran, you don't even necessarily need to build the weapon. You can just have the threshold state. And after the tragic events of that air crash, I think there are going to be many forces within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps who are going to say, why be pushed around by the Israelis anymore on this? So I think we are in, after putting that stability together in the Cold War and denuclearizing to some degree in the post-Cold War, we blended down old Soviet warheads and used them to make electric power in the Midwest. I think we're in for a period of renewed instability. And that also wouldn't be a bad question for the presidential debate. I'm happy to send a list later on.
Please do so. Well, on that not particularly happy note,
yeah.
I should say this really is, it's a great read. And, you know, the first draft of history, it's a real sense of, if you get the book, the texture of this and the characters, some very interesting vignettes and moments in the book as well. So highly recommended.
Well, thank you so much.
David Sanger, thank you very much indeed. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you all.